Hey everyone! Tonight we are stepping away from the neon lights and the hum of the modern world to stand on a sun-bleached riverbank where the air tastes of silt and ancient stone. You feel the heat radiating off the Sahara, a dry, oppressive weight that settles deep into your lungs. But just ahead, there is the miracle of the Nile, a ribbon of deep blue slicing through the scorched earth. You are standing in the middle of the first millennium, watching the shadow of the Roman Empire retreat like a receding tide, leaving behind a power vacuum that should have been filled by chaos. Instead, you see something much more resilient rising from the dust of the old Meroitic kings. You see the birth of three kingdoms, Nobatia, Makuria, and Alodia nations that will hold the line of their faith and their culture against the most powerful caliphates in history for nearly 1,000 years. It's a world of towering granite cathedrals in the middle of the desert of archers. Who can pick a man's eye out from 100 yards and of a brand of Christianity that felt more at home in the heart of Africa than it ever did in the marble halls of Rome? You probably wouldn't survive this honestly. Between the Nile crocodiles the size of a rowboat and the fact that water is often more of a suggestion than a reality once you step 10 feet from the river, you'd be a sunderied relic before the first prayer bell rang. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, so go ahead and post your location and local time in the comments. It is always wild to see how far these stories travel while we lay all tucked away in our own corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the shifting sands of the Batn el Hayar, the belly of stones, where the Nile twists through narrow, treacherous gorges. The wind whips fine grit against your face, and your leather sandals are starting to feel like they're made of lead. To your north, the Roman world is fracturing, but here, the heirs of the ancient Kushites are finding their second wind. You see the remnants of Meroe, those steep, slender pyramids standing like silent sentinels, but the people moving among them are different now. They aren't the subjects of the old pharaohs anymore. You watch a group of travelers navigating the first cataract, their boats laden with Mediterranean wine and African ebony, and you realize that you are at the ultimate crossroads. The year is roughly 540 CE. You notice that the atmosphere is thick with more than just heat. There is a palpable sense of religious anticipation. To the north, in Constantinople, the Emperor Justinian and his formidable wife, Theodora, are having what you might call a spirited domestic disagreement over the soul of Nubia. You see, Justinian wants these Nile kingdoms to follow his Chalcedonian brand of Christianity, while Theodora is a staunch supporter of the Miaphysite, often called Coptic view. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine theological divide or a tactical play for political influence. But for you, standing on the dusty road to the city of Faras, it feels like a race. You might find it funny that the salvation of an entire region depended on which imperial messenger could ride their camel faster. But in the 6th century, that was the peak of high-stakes diplomacy. You notice a small procession approaching. These are the Nobatians. They are the northernmost of the three kingdoms, and they have a reputation for being, well, let's say enthusiastic warriors. Before their conversion, they were known to worship Isis, and even human sacrifice wasn't entirely off the table. You definitely wouldn't want to be the honored guest at one of those parties. But as you watch them now, you see them dismantling their old temples. They are scrubbing away the images of ancient gods and replacing them with the austere, wide-eyed faces of Byzantine saints. It's a rebranding effort on a civilizational scale. The landscape shifts as you move south. The harsh, rocky outcrops of Nobatia give way to the wider, more fertile plains of Makuria. This is the powerhouse. You see the capital, Old Dongola, sitting proudly on a bend in the river. The architecture here is a bizarre and beautiful hybrid. You see massive stone foundations that look like they belong in Egypt, topped with red brick arches that feel like they were plucked straight from a Mediterranean villa. There's a certain rugged elegance to it. You pass a local market where the smell of roasting lamb and fermented sorghum beer called bilbil fills the air. A merchant tries to sell you a pair of intricately woven sandals, claiming they were blessed by a monk from the Wadi Natron, and you can't help but chuckle at the universal nature of the tourist trap. One of the most mainstream historical facts about this era is that the Nubian conversion was remarkably peaceful. Unlike many other regions where the cross was brought on the edge of a sword, the Nubian kings seemed to have invited it in. They saw themselves as the natural heirs to a divine world order. But here's a quirky tidbit for you. While they embraced the new god, they didn't entirely ditch their old habits. Archaeologists have found Nubian graves from this transition period where the deceased is buried, with a very Christian cross around their neck, but also a bowl of food and a set of weapons for the afterlife just in case the whole heaven thing didn't provide a catering service. It is that belt and suspenders approach to theology that really makes you appreciate the human element of history. You continue your trek further south, beyond the confluence where the two Niles meet like liquid silk. This is Alodia, the kingdom of the sun. It's further away, more mysterious, and arguably the most prosperous of the three. You see sprawling gardens irrigated by the Sakia, those massive wooden water wheels that groan and creak like living things. The sound becomes the heartbeat of your journey, a constant, rhythmic thumbclick that signals life in a land that should be dead. As the sun begins to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, you realize that these three kingdoms are not just isolated outposts. They are a wall. To the north, the old world is dying, and a new force is rising in the Arabian Peninsula, a force that will soon come knocking on Nubia's door. But for now, the bells of the cathedrals are ringing for vespers. You watch the light catch the golden crosses atop the mud-brick domes, and you feel a strange sense of peace. You're standing in a Christian African empire that the West has largely forgotten, but the stones under your feet remember everything. You find a place to rest near the riverbank, far enough away to avoid the hippos, which, by the way, are basically 3,000 pounds water demons that will end your journey real quick if you get too close. As you watch the stars begin to poke through the velvet sky, you think about the sheer audacity of these kingdoms. They are surrounded by the world's harshest desert, caught between the shifting gears of empires, and yet they are thriving. You close your eyes, the sound of the Nile lapping against the shore, knowing that tomorrow, the real test begins. The desert is quiet, but the history is loud. The morning mist on the Nile is deceptive. It feels cool for about 5 minutes before the sun hammers down, reminding you that you're in one of the hottest inhabited places on Earth. As you shake the sand out of your hair, you start to get a better sense of the political map you're walking through. You aren't just a Nubia, that as a catch-all term we moderns use because we like things tidy. In reality, you are navigating three distinct siblings who don't always get along, but definitely share the same DNA. To your north, stretching from the first to the second cataract of the Nile, is Nobatia. Its capital, Faras, is a vibrant frontier town, the kind of place where you can find Egyptian linen, Byzantine glass, and a very high probability of getting into a bar fight over a game of dice. You notice the Nobatians are a bit more frontier than their southern neighbors. They are the buffer zone, the shield that keeps the Roman Byzantine world at arm's length while soaking up all its best fashion trends. Traveling south, you cross into Makuria. If Nobatia is the shield, Makuria is the heart. It stretches down to the fertile reach of the Nile known as the Dongola Reach. This is the heavyweight champion of the three kingdoms. You see the city of Old Dongola rising like a mirage, massive stone walls, palatial residences, and a cathedral that looks like it could hold a small army. There's a certain new money energy here. Even though the civilization is ancient, the Makurians are the master builders, the ones who decided that if they were going to live in the desert, they were going to do it in style. You might think you're tough, but try dragging 10-ton granite pillars across the sand without a forklift. Yeah, you probably wouldn't survive the first afternoon of that shift. Then, there's Alodia, or Alwa, the southernmost sibling. To get there, you have to travel past the junction where the Blue and White Niles merge. It's a long trek, and the air gets more humid as the desert starts to flirt with the savanna. Alodia is the wealthy, slightly mysterious sister who lives in a palace made of gold and ivory, at least. That's what the travelers' rumors say. Its capital, Soba, is legendary for its gardens and the sheer number of churches. Historians still argue whether Alodia was actually a centralized kingdom, or more of a loose confederation of powerful chiefdoms. But looking at the scale of the ruins, it's clear they weren't hurting for resources. One mainstream historical fact that hits you as you observe these three is that they weren't just influenced by Christianity, they were legally and culturally transformed by it. By the mid-6th century, the old temples to Ammon and Isis were being repurposed or left to the scorpions. But here's the quirky tidbit: the transition wasn't exactly a clean break. In many of the early Christian settlements, you'll see people still using amulets that look suspiciously like the ancient Egyptian ankh, but now they're calling them crosses of life. It's the ultimate spiritual rebranding. If you can't beat the old magic, just give it a new name and keep moving. You notice the social hierarchy here is surprisingly fluid for a medieval society. You see women in the marketplaces of Dongola wearing intricate silver jewelry and commanding respect as they trade textiles. In fact, Nubian society is matrilineal. Power and property often flow through the mother's side. This creates a fascinating dynamic where the king's sister is often more politically significant than his own wife. You might find that confusing, but in a world where "who's your daddy" was a common question, the Nubians decided that "who's your mommy" was a much more reliable metric for royal bloodlines. As you walk through the outskirts of a Makurian village, you see the Sakia wheels turning. These aren't just tools, they are the reason these kingdoms exist. Before the Sakia arrived from Egypt, farmers could only plant what the Nile flood naturally reached. But with these ox-driven wheels, you see them pulling water up into elevated canals, turning the brown dust into emerald green fields of barley and dates. The creak of the wood is the soundtrack to your life here. It's a rhythmic, hypnotic sound that almost makes you forget that if the wheel breaks, the village starves. No pressure, right? You stop to chat with a local potter who is molding a delicate, egg-shell-thin bowl. Nubian pottery is world-class. It's painted with vibrant birds, fine leaves, and geometric patterns that look like they belong in a modern art gallery. He tells you a joke about a Nobatian soldier who tried to pay for a beer with a Roman coin that had been out of circulation for 100 years apparently. Inflation is a joke that translates across all centuries. You laugh, but you realize how connected this place is. You see red-slipped pottery from North Africa and amphory from Gaza, stacked in the corners of the stalls. These kingdoms aren't isolated islands. They are a vital bridge between the Mediterranean and the heart of Africa. As the afternoon sun reaches its peak, you find shade under a massive sycamore fig tree. You watch a group of children playing a game with stones in the dust, their laughter echoing off the mud brick walls of a nearby monastery. It's a peaceful scene, but you can't ignore the tension in the air. To the north, the world is changing. Word has reached the courts of Dongola that the Persian Empire has fallen, and in new power the Rashidun Caliphate has taken Egypt. The buffer of the Byzantine Empire is gone. Now, it's just the desert, the Nile, and the three kingdoms. Historians still argue whether the Nubian kings realized the scale of the threat coming from the north, or if they thought it was just another local skirmish. But as you look at the thick walls of the fortifications being built along the river, you get the feeling they weren't taking any chances. They've survived the Romans, the Persians, and the collapse of their own ancestors' empires. They are resilient, they are proud, and they have a very good reason to keep their bows strong. You take a sip of lukewarm water from your goatskin canteen. It tastes faintly of leather and river silt, which is about as good as it gets out here. You look toward the northern horizon, where the heat haze makes the world look like it's melting. Somewhere out there, an army is moving, but for now, the bells of the churches in Makuria are calling people to noon prayer, and the Sakia keeps on turning. The three siblings are ready, even if they don't know exactly what they're getting ready for. You just hope your sandals hold up for the next few hundred miles. The dust of the road hasn't even settled on your skin before you realize that the air in the royal courts of Nubia has turned electric with debate. You are witnessing one of the most polite, yet cutthroat, ideological races in human history. The year is approximately 543 CE, and the Byzantine Empire has decided it's high time the Nubians picked a side in the great Christian family feud. You see, back in Constantinople, Emperor Justinian is a Chalcedonian. He believes in the two natures of Christ. His wife, Empress Theodora, is a Miaphysite. She believes in one unified nature. To us, it sounds like splitting hairs, but to them, it was worth risking a civil war or, in this case, a literal race across the desert. You find yourself riding alongside a frantic messenger sent by Theodora. She's pulled a classic fast one on her husband. She reportedly sent word to the governor of Upper Egypt to delay Justinian's missionaries by any means necessary, even threatening him with execution, just so her own team could reach the king of Nobatia first. You have to appreciate the audacity. It's like a 6th century version of an undercover mission. You probably wouldn't survive the pace of this trek, honestly. These messengers aren't stopping for scenic photos or snack breaks. They are riding camels until the animals' knees buckle, all to ensure that when the Nubian king Silko opens his doors, he hears the right version of the gospel first. As you enter the gates of Faras, the Nobatian capital, you see the result of this hustle. The Miaphysite mission arrived first, and King Silko, impressed by the grandeur and the persistence of Theodora's envoy, officially converts. You watch as the temples are reconsecrated. It is a surreal sight. The old Egyptian-style murals of kings being blessed by Ra or Amun are being covered with thin layers of plaster. and you see the first outlines of dark-eyed haloed figures being sketched over them. Historians still argue whether Silko converted out of genuine spiritual conviction, or because he saw a strategic alliance with the Empress as his best bet for survival. But the impact is undeniable. Within a few decades, the southern kingdom of Makuria and the distant Alodia follow suit. Though Makuria initially flirts with the Emperor's official church, before eventually joining its brothers in the Miaphysite camp, one mainstream historical fact that stands out is that this conversion didn't just bring a new god, it brought a whole new bureaucratic system. You see the arrival of Greek and Coptic scribes, and suddenly, the royal court is buzzing with new titles like Eparch and Domesticus. But here's the quirky tidbit that keeps things grounded. Despite their new piety, the Nubian elite refused to give up their massive, ornate umbrellas to a Nubian royal. An umbrella wasn't just for the sun, it was a symbol of divine protection and worldly power. You'll see frescoes of the Virgin Mary, and standing right next to her is a Nubian official being shaded by a servant with a giant, colorful parasol. It's a wonderful bit of local flavor. Heavenly grace is great, but a little literal shade goes a long way. You notice that as the cross spreads, it's not just the kings who are changing. You walk through a small village and see a commoner etching a tiny cross into the side of their water jar. There is a sense of belonging to something massive, something that stretches from the Ethiopian highlands all the way to the Pillars of Hercules. You feel the pulse of a unified Nubia. Even if they are still three separate kingdoms, they are now part of the oikoumene, the civilized Christian world. But while they are looking toward the Mediterranean for their liturgy, they are still very much sons and daughters of the Nile. There's a beautiful irony in your surroundings. You are in a land that the Romans considered barbaric and at the edge of the world. Yet you are seeing a literacy rate and a level of artistic output that would rival many European cities of the time. You pass by a monastery where monks are painstakingly copying manuscripts in a local variant of the Greek alphabet. They aren't just reciting prayers, they are recording their own history. You realize that by choosing the rebel faith of Theodora, the Coptic faith, they have unintentionally built a bridge to their neighbors in Egypt and Ethiopia that will prove far more durable than any alliance with the distant Byzantine emperor. The sun begins to set over the Nile, casting long, dramatic shadows across the newly built church of Pharos. You see the priests in their white linens, the smell of frankincense clashing with the earthy scent of the river. It feels like a golden age is beginning. But you also notice something else. In the market, traders are whispering about a new prophet in the north, and a movement in Arabia that is spreading like wildfire. The Nubians have just found their new identity, and they are about to have to fight to keep it. You find a quiet spot near the harbor, watching the reflection of the stars in the water. You think about Theodora's messenger and the sheer luck of history. If a camel had stumbled, if a governor hadn't been intimidated, the entire religious landscape of East Africa might have been different. You take a bite of a sundry date sweet, dusty, and tough, much like the land itself. The bells start to ring for the evening service, a sound that will define this valley for the next 8 centuries. You're witnessing the start of a marathon, and the Nubians are just getting their second wind. The year is 651 CE, and the air in the capital of Makuria, Old Dongola, is thick with more than just the usual summer heat. It's thick with the smell of wood smoke and the metallic tang of sharpening blades. You're standing on the ramparts of the city, looking north, and for the first time in centuries, the horizon isn't just shimmering with heat, it's shimmering with the glint of armor. The Rashidun Caliphate, having already swept through Persia and Egypt like a desert storm, has finally arrived at the gates of the Middle Kingdom of Nubia. This isn't a small border skirmish. This is a full-scale invasion led by the governor of Egypt, Abdullah ibn Saud. You probably wouldn't survive the first 10 minutes of this siege. Honestly, the Arabs have brought something the Nubians haven't seen in force before. The Manyanic, or heavy catapults. You hear the terrifying whomp of the catapults launching boulders into the city. One of them strikes the main cathedral, the pride of Dongola, and you see the stone crumble as the roof sags. It's a moment of pure, unadulterated tension. But then, you look at the Nubian defense, and you realize the invaders have made a massive tactical error. They expected a quick capitulation from barbarians, but instead, they've run into a wall of the most disciplined archers on the planet. You watch as the Nubian bowmen take their positions. They don't fire in messy volleys, they aim. Historians still argue whether the legendary accuracy of the Nubians was due to a specific type of composite bow or just a lifetime of cultural obsession with the sport. But the results are terrifyingly clear. The Arab chronicles themselves admit that their soldiers began losing eyes by the hundreds. You see the panic in the invading camp as men realize that even a tiny gap in their helmets is a death sentence. It is here that the Nubians earn their permanent nickname in Arabic history, Rumat al-Hadaq, the Archers of the Eyes. After weeks of stalemate and a lot of eye patches, something extraordinary happens. Instead of a fight to the death, both sides sit down at the negotiating table. You are a fly on the wall for the creation of the Baqt. This isn't a standard surrender. It's a non-aggression pact, a diplomatic let's just agree to be neighbors. The mainstream historical fact that makes the Baqt so famous is its longevity. It will remain the governing treaty between the Islamic North and the Christian South for over 600 years. That's longer than the United States has even been a concept. But here is the quirky tidbit that makes the Baqt feel so human. It wasn't just about borders, it was a shopping list. The treaty stipulated that the Nubians would send 360 slaves to the north every year. But in return, the Egyptians had to send back fixed quantities of wheat, barley, wine, and wait for it high-quality linen cloth. It was essentially a stata-level trade agreement disguised as a tribute. You see the Nubian king nodding at the terms, probably thinking about how much he needs that Egyptian grain for the next dry season. It's less clash of civilizations and more negotiating a long-term lease. You notice that the Baqt also included a clause that both sides had to maintain a mosque in the Nubian capital and a church in the Egyptian border towns for travelers. You walk past the site in Dongola, where the mosque is being staked out as a small, symbolic gesture of religious tolerance born out of pragmatic necessity. You see the Arab diplomats and the Nubian priests eyeing each other with a mix of respect and deep suspicion. It's a cold peace, but in a world of constant conquest, a cold peace is a miracle. As you walk through the battered streets of Dongola after the treaty is signed, you see the resilience of the people. They are already clearing the rubble from the cathedral. They didn't win in the traditional sense, but they didn't lose. They are the only power in the early medieval world to stop the initial Arab expansion in its tracks and force a diplomatic stalemate. You feel a shift in the energy of the city. There's a new sense of pride. They've looked the most powerful army in the world in the eye and, well, they shot it out. The sun sets over the Nile, and for the first time in weeks, the catapults are silent. You see the campfires of the retreating Arab army in the distance, and the lanterns being lit in the windows of Dongola. The Baqt is a strange, messy compromise, but it's the reason this Christian culture will survive into the age of the Renaissance. You take a deep breath of the night air, which finally smells like river water again instead of smoke. You realize that sometimes, the greatest victory isn't destroying your enemy, it's making it too expensive for them to keep fighting you. You lean against a stone pillar, the Archers of the Eyes still patrolling the walls above you, and you finally let your guard down. For now, the frontier is safe. You're standing on the sun-baked training grounds of Makuria, and the sound you hear isn't the rushing of the Nile, but a synchronized, metallic thrum. It's a sound that would have sent a shiver down the spine of any 7th century general. You are watching the legendary Nubian archers practice. They aren't using the massive, clunky longbows of medieval Europe. These are shorter, incredibly powerful bows that require a lifetime of muscle memory to master. You see a young man, probably no older than 17, pull his string back to his ear. He doesn't squint or hesitate. He releases, and a split second later, a wooden target 50 yards away is thwacked right in the center. You probably wouldn't survive a weekend at this boot camp. The sheer physical strain of drawing these bows for hours on end would have your shoulders screaming before the mid-morning snack break. The skill of these men is the only reason you aren't currently speaking a different language or paying taxes to a different empire. During the first and second battles of Dongola, the Rashidun Caliphate, the same force that had just toppled the Persian Sassanids and crippled the Byzantines, encountered something they simply couldn't compute. One mainstream historical fact that echoes through the Arabic chronicles is the sheer shock of the Muslim soldiers. They were used to melee combat, to the glorious charge of the cavalry. But the Nubians refused to play by those rules. Instead, the Nubians stayed behind their walls or used the rocky terrain to pick off the invaders with terrifying precision. They didn't aim for the chest or the horse, they aimed for the face. You can almost feel the psychological toll this took on the invading army. Imagine being a veteran of a dozen battles, only to see your comrades falling not from a sword stroke, but because they dared to peek over their shields for a fraction of a second. This is where the term Rumat al-Hadaq, the Archers of the Eyes, became a badge of honor for the Nubians and a warning for the North. Historians still argue whether this was a formal military doctrine or just a byproduct of the Nubians' traditional hunting techniques. But the effect was a tactical stalemate. It forced the Arab commanders to realize that a total conquest of the Nile corridor would be a meat grinder they couldn't afford. But here is a quirky tidbit that usually gets left out of the grand history books. The Nubians were so proud of their archery that they actually turned it into a competitive sport that doubled as a religious festival. You see groups of archers gathering near the village churches, shooting at small gourds suspended from palm trees. The winner wouldn't just get bragging rights. They'd often be the ones chosen to guard the bishop or the king's personal treasury. It was a society where your social standing was literally tied to your eye-hand coordination. If you couldn't hit a moving target while standing on a rocking boat in the Nile, you were basically relegated to the maybe next year pile. As you walk through the military barracks, you notice that these archers aren't just lone wolves. They are part of a highly organized military machine. You see them cleaning their arrows with a mixture of oils and curiously some sort of dessert plant extract. There's a rumor that they used mild toxins on their tips, not enough to kill instantly, but enough to ensure that even a grazing wound would take a soldier out of the fight. It's that kind of pragmatic, slightly ruthless ingenuity that kept the border secure. You find yourself sitting with an old veteran who has retired to a small farm by the river. He shows you his thumb, which is calloused and slightly deformed from decades of pulling the bowstring. He tells you that the secret isn't in the bow, but in the breath. You have to breathe with the river, he says, and release when the water is still. It sounds poetic, but then he shows you how he can still pin a beetle to a tree from 20 paces, and you realize he's not being metaphorical. The presence of these archers created a unique balance of terror along the Nile. Because the Caliphate knew they couldn't easily take the territory, they were forced into the diplomatic channel that led to the Baqt Treaty. You realize that peace in this part of the world wasn't bought with kind words or shared values. It was bought with the threat of a well-placed arrow. It's a sobering thought as you watch the sunset over the training fields. The shadows of the archers stretch long over the sand, looking like dark needles ready to stitch the horizon shut. You head back toward the city of Dongola, passing a group of young kids playing with miniature bows made of reeds. They're already practicing their aim, laughing as they try to hit a stray sandal. It's cute, until you remember that in a few years, these kids will be the line between their culture's survival and its disappearance. You take one last look at the archers of the eyes, patrolling the high walls, their silhouettes sharp against the deepening blue of the sky, and you feel a profound respect for the precision that saved a kingdom. The gates of old Dongola swing open for you, and as you step inside, you realize that everything you thought you knew about medieval African cities is about to be rewritten. You aren't looking at a collection of huts or a dusty outpost. You are standing in a sprawling, sophisticated metropolis of stone and brick that served as the beating heart of Makuria for nearly 1,000 years. The first thing that hits you is the sheer verticality of the place. To your left, the throne hall rises to stories high, a massive, blocky fortress of a building that looks like it could survive a direct hit from a meteor. You probably wouldn't survive the climb up the internal staircases in this heat. The humidity inside these thick-walled buildings is like a damp wool blanket, and the stairs were built for people with much better cardio than the average 21st century human. As you walk through the central district, you notice that the city is a masterclass in urban planning. The streets are narrow to catch the shadows, creating wind tunnels that offer the only relief from the relentless Sudanese sun. One mainstream historical fact that stands out about old Dongola is its transformation. The massive throne hall you're looking at wasn't always a palace. It started its life as a magnificent church before being converted into a royal reception hall. Historians still argue whether this conversion was a result of a changing political ideology or simply a practical use of the sturdiest building in town. But the result is a space that feels both sacred and intimidating. You can still see the faded outlines of Christian frescoes on the walls, even as the king sits on a dais to receive foreign diplomats. But here is a quirky tidbit you won't find in most textbooks. The people of Dongola were obsessed with their plumbing. As you navigate the residential quarters, you see sophisticated terracotta pipes and drainage systems that would have made a Roman engineer nod in approval. They even had indoor toilets in the wealthier villas, complete with flushing mechanisms, gravity and buckets of water. But still, you might think of the Middle Ages as a time of grime and open sewers, but in the heart of Nubia they were living in a level of hygiene that much of Europe wouldn't catch up to for another 500 years. If you're going to be a dessert king, you might as well have a clean bathroom, right? You notice the materials used to build this city are a testament to the kingdom's wealth. There is granite everywhere, deep gray and pink stone hauled from the cataracts and polished until it shines. You see red brick arches that seem to defy gravity, a technique imported from the Byzantines, but perfected here in the African sun. You pass by a construction crew working on a new expansion for the great church. They aren't using mortar in the way you'd expect. They ray fitting stones together with such precision that you couldn't slide a papyrus reed between them. It is the kind of craftsmanship that suggests a society that expects to be around for a very, very long time. In the marketplace at the foot of the Royal Hill, the world comes to you. You see ivory from the deep south, gold from the Red Sea hills, and surprisingly fine silk from China that has traveled the Silk Road to the Red Sea and up the Nile. You watch a group of scholars debating in the shade of a portico. They are speaking a mixture of Old Nubian and Greek, arguing over the finer points of a liturgy sent down from Alexandria. You realize that Old Dongola isn't just a fortress, it's a brain trust. It's where the culture of the Nile is preserved, refined, and projected outward. You find yourself wandering toward the riverfront, where the city walls meet the Nile. The fortifications here are massive, designed to withstand the annual flooding of the river and the occasional unwanted guest from the north. You see a series of river docks where the royal galleys are moored, their prows decorated with the sign of the cross and the protective eye of the old gods just for a bit of extra insurance. The sound of the river is a constant bass note to the melody of the city. The shouts of merchants, the ringing of church bells, and the rhythmic chanting of monks from the nearby monastery of Anthony. As evening falls, the granite walls of the city soak up the orange glow of the sunset. You see the lights of the upper city flickering to life as oil lamps are lit in the palace windows. From this height, you can look out across the Nile at the endless desert, and you realize how much of a miracle Old Dongola really is. It's a stone defiance against the shifting sands. You find a spot on a balcony overlooking the main square. Feeling the cool evening breeze finally kick in, you take a bite of a honey-soaked pastry bought from a street vendor. Sweet, sticky, and probably terrible for your teeth, but worth every bite. The city feels invincible tonight, a granite heart beating in the silence of the Sahara. You close your eyes, listening to the muffled sounds of a capital at rest, knowing that these walls have seen 8 centuries of history and aren't planning on crumbling anytime soon. You are traveling north now, back toward the border of Nobatia, where the desert winds howl through the rocky canyons of the Second Cataract. The air is drier here, stinging your nostrils, but the destination is worth the grit in your teeth. You are approaching Faras, the administrative jewel of the north. From a distance, it looks like a modest citadel, but as you descend into the valley, you see the true treasure, the Cathedral of Faras. It is a massive structure of mud brick and stone, but it's what's inside that stops your breath as you step through the heavy wooden doors, leaving the blinding white glare of the sun behind. Your eyes take a moment to adjust to the cool, insensitive gloom. Then, the walls begin to speak. Every square inch of the interior is covered in vibrant, stunning frescoes. You see rows of dark-skinned saints, their eyes wide and haunting, staring back at you with an intensity that feels almost supernatural. These aren't the pale, ethereal figures of European cathedrals. These are African Christians, depicted with the deep obsidian skin tones, the intricate facial markings, and the ornate robes of the Nubian elite. You see the 3 young men in a fiery furnace, protected by an angel whose wings look like they were plucked from a peacock. You probably wouldn't survive the artistic pressure of this place. The painters here worked with a palette of ochre, soot, and crushed minerals that had to be applied to wet plaster, in a race against the desert as evaporation. One slip of the brush, and you've just given a bishop a permanent squint in front of his entire congregation. One mainstream historical fact that makes Faras so legendary is its preservation by accident. When the Nile was dammed in the 1960s to create Lake Nasser, international teams rushed to save these frescoes before the water swallowed them. They found that, over the centuries, as the kingdom shifted, newer walls had been built directly in front of the old ones, and the blowing sands of the Sahara had filled the gaps, perfectly mummifying the paint. It's like a time capsule that was never meant to be opened. Historians still argue whether the specific style of the Faras school was an independent African invention or a direct evolution of Coptic art from Egypt. But looking at the unique elongated fingers and the geometric patterns on the vestments, it feels like something entirely its own. But here is the quirky tidbit that adds a layer of humanity to this sacred space. The walls are covered in graffiti left by medieval pilgrims. As you lean in close to a painting of the Archangel Michael, you see tiny, scratched inscriptions in Greek, Coptic, and Old Nubian. They aren't profound theological treatises. They're the 8th century version of I was here. You see things like, I, Petros the scribe, visited this holy place, or may God have mercy on the soul of my mother. It's a reminder that this wasn't just a museum. It was a living, breathing community where people brought their anxieties and their hopes to the feet of these painted giants. You might find it funny that even in a grand cathedral, humans can't resist the urge to carve their names into the furniture. You notice a particular fresco of a Nubian queen, protected by the Virgin Mary. The queen is dressed in a robe so detailed you can almost feel the texture of the silk and the weight of the gold embroidery. This is the eparch's territory, a powerful official who governed the north on behalf of the king in Dongola. The art here serves a double purpose. It's a tribute to God, but it's also a massive flex of political power. By depicting themselves alongside biblical figures, the Nubian royals were claiming a divine right to rule that was visible to every illiterate farmer who walked through these doors. As you wander deeper into the side chapels, you find the bishop's list. It's a literal, chronological record of every man who held the seat of Faras for centuries, often accompanied by their portraits. It gives you a sense of the staggering continuity of this culture. While Europe was wading through the Dark Ages and empires were rising and falling like waves, the bishops of Faras were steadily recording their names, one after another, maintaining a chain of literacy and faith that seemed unbreakable. The sound of a distant bell echoes through the vaulted ceiling, and you see a group of deacons preparing for the evening liturgy. They carry lamps filled with castor oil, and as they light them, the flickering flames dance across the faces of the saints. The eyes of the frescoes seem to move, in the shifting light, watching you with a quiet, ancient wisdom. It's an overwhelming experience, a sensory overload of color and faith in the middle of a barren wasteland. You exit the cathedral just as the first stars appear, the cooling desert air hitting your face like a splash of water. You look back at the silhouette of the building, knowing that one day, the sands will reclaim it, and much later, the Nile itself will bury it deep beneath its waters. But for now, the colors are bright, the faith is strong, and the dark-skinned saints of Faras stand guard over the frontier. You take a deep breath, the scent of the river, and the desert mixing in your lungs, and you start the long walk back to your camp. The wide eyes of the saints still burned into your memory. You are back in the heart of Makuria, but the atmosphere has shifted from the military grid of the frontier to something far more ethereal. You are standing in the shadow of the great church of Old Dongola during a royal procession, and you notice something that would make a European monarch's head spin. The king is approaching, but he isn't just wearing a crown and carrying a scepter. He is dressed in the snowy white linens of a priest, and as he moves toward the altar, the crowd doesn't just bow, they fall into a silence usually reserved for the divine. This is the era of the monkings, a period where the line between the palace and the pulpit didn't just blur, it completely evaporated. In Nubia, the king was often an ordained priest. Think about that for a second. You probably wouldn't survive the schedule of a Nubian sovereign. You'd be up at 4 a.m. for matins, spend your midday presiding over grueling legal disputes about goat ownership and water rights, and then spend your evening performing the high mystery of the Eucharist. It was a life of extreme discipline, where the king's authority wasn't just based on his army or his gold, but on his perceived holiness. He was the vicar of Christ in the middle of the Nile, a bridge between the dusty reality of the desert and the golden halls of heaven. Historians still argue whether this dual role was a genuine expression of piety or a brilliant tactical move to prevent the church from becoming a rival power center. By becoming the head of the church himself, the king ensured that there was no pope versus emperor drama in Dongola. One mainstream historical fact that supports this unique setup is the discovery of royal tombs, where the kings were buried not with traditional weapons of war, but with the vestments and hand crosses of a bishop. They wanted to enter the afterlife not as conquerors, but as humble servants of the liturgy. But here as a quirky tidbit, even these holy men had a bit of a flair for the dramatic. While they preached humility, they traveled in style. Whenever the king priest moved between cities, he was preceded by a choir of boys singing hymns, and a personal guard carrying a true cross encrusted with emeralds. If you were a peasant working your field and saw this golden, singing parade coming over the horizon, you'd probably think the apocalypse was starting. It was a total sensory takeover, designed to remind everyone that the guy in charge had a direct line to the Almighty. You watch the king now as he enters the sanctuary. The heikel, or the altar area, is hidden behind a heavy curtain, a tradition of the Coptic and Nubian church that emphasizes the mystery of the divine. Only the king priest and his highest deacons are allowed behind that veil. You hear the rhythmic clinking of the censer and the low, melodic drone of old Nubian chants. The smell of burning frankincense is so thick it starts to make your head swim. In this moment, the king isn't a politician, he's a medium. He is literally standing in the gap for his people, praying for the Nile to rise and for the archers of the eyes to stay sharp. You notice the interaction between the king and the common people after the service. They approach him to kiss the hem of his robe or to have him bless their children. There's a strange intimacy to it. In the West, kings were often distant, terrifying figures in high castles. In Nubia, because the king was also your local priest, he was woven into the fabric of your spiritual life. He baptized your kids. He gave you the bread of life. It's a level of soft power that modern leaders could only dream of. As the sun sets and the king retires to his modest quarters in the monastery, not the palace, mind you, because tonight is a fast day, you realize that this is why the Nubian kingdoms lasted so long. They weren't just held together by laws, but by a shared, lived mythology. The king was the personification of their survival. You find a quiet corner of the monastery courtyard, listening to the monks recite the psalms in the darkening twilight. The air is cool, the stone is ancient, and for a moment, you feel the weight of a kingdom that believed its very existence was a form of prayer. You take a sip of cool water from a clay jar, thinking about the discipline it takes to be both a lion and a lamb. Tomorrow, the king will be back to dealing with tax records and border disputes. But tonight, he's just a man in white linen, whispering to the stars. You are standing on the bustling docks of Old Dongola, and if you look closely at the cargo being unloaded from a sun-bleached galley, you'll see something that feels out of place. In the heart of Africa, there are crates of fine silk, amphorae of premium olive oil, and even delicate glassware that catches the desert sun like trapped lightning. You realize that while the Nubian kingdoms are separated from the Mediterranean by hundreds of miles of cataracts and sand, they are spiritually and culturally tethered to the Queen of Cities, Constantinople. You are witnessing the Byzantine connection, a long-distance relationship that defines the prestige of the Nubian court. You probably wouldn't survive the voyage these goods took. Months of navigating the treacherous Nile, dodging tax-collecting pirates, and praying the heat doesn't shatter the glass or spoil the wine. The mainstream historical fact here is that Nubia was the southernmost outpost of the Byzantine cultural sphere, long after the Byzantine Empire lost control of Egypt. Even though the Arab conquest of the north in the 7th century physically cut Nubia off from the Roman world, the Nubians refused to let go. They continued to use Greek in their liturgy. They modeled their court dress on the elaborate silks of the Byzantine emperors, and they even adopted the same complex titles for their officials. Historians still argue whether the Nubians truly saw themselves as Romans, or if they were simply using Byzantine aesthetics as a status symbol to distinguish themselves from their non-Christian neighbors. Regardless, when you walk through the palace, you see the king of Makuria wearing a loros, that long, jeweled scarf just like a junior version of the emperor himself. But here as a quirky tidbit, the Nubians were such fans of Byzantine style that they actually imported their architectural blueprints through a medieval version of a lookbook. Scribes would travel to Egypt or the Levant, sketch the domes and arches of famous churches, and bring those drawings back to the Nile. However, because they were building with mud brick and local granite instead of marble, they had to improvise. This led to a unique Nubian Byzantine-style squad, powerful domes and thick, sturdy arches that look like a Byzantine church that's been hitting the gym. It's an aesthetic of survival, taking the elegance of the north and toughening it up for the African sun. You notice a group of diplomats arriving from the north. They aren't soldiers, they are melodic messengers. In this era, the connection was often maintained through the exchange of liturgical music and chants. You hear a choir in a nearby chapel practicing a Greek hymn, but they've added a rhythmic, percussive pulse that you won't hear in the Hagia Sophia. It's a fascinating blend. You realize that for a Nubian, being Byzantine wasn't about where you lived, it was about the oikoumene, the civilized, Christian world. By speaking the language and singing the songs of the empire, they were telling the world that they weren't isolated, they were part of a global superpower. Even if that superpower was thousands of miles away, there's a certain melancholy to this connection. Though, you see a scholar in the scriptorium carefully repairing a Greek manuscript that has been thumbed through for 3 generations. He knows that no new copies are coming from the north anytime soon. The Islamic expansion has created a massive geopolitical wall, and the Nubians are effectively holding the line for a world that is slowly forgetting they exist. You see the pride in his eyes as he recreates a capital letter in gold leaf. To him, this isn't just a book, it's a lifeline. It's the proof that his kingdom belongs to the grandest tradition of the ancient world. As you walk along the river at twilight, you see the reflection of a church dome in the water. It's shaped like a Byzantine crown, but it's made of the same silt that the farmers use for their crops. This is the genius of Nubia. They took a distant, imperial dream and made it African. They didn't just copy the Mediterranean. They digested it and turned it into something new. You find a small tavern where the merchants drink diluted wine and talk about the latest rumors from Cairo and Damascus. They speak of the Byzantine emperor as a distant, almost mythical figure, a protector who might one day return to sweep the world clean. You take a sip of the local beer, which is much more reliable than the imported wine anyway. You think about the tenacity of a people who choose to identify with a fading empire across a sea they might never see. It's a testament to the power of culture over geography. The sun disappears, and the desert sky opens up, vast and indifferent. But here on the Nile, the bells are ringing for a service that follows the exact same rhythm as the one being held in a cathedral in Greece or Italy. The connection is thin, but it is made of silk and prayer, and in Nubia, that's enough to hold back the dark. The sun hasn't even cleared the horizon yet, but the desert is already noisy. As you step out of your sleeping quarters near the riverbank, you hear a sound that defines the very existence of these kingdoms, the Sakia. It's a rhythmic, agonizing groan of wood against wood, a high-pitched protest that carries for miles across the flat plains. You walk toward the sound and see a pair of oxen, eyes blinkered and heads low, walking in an endless circle. They are turning a massive horizontal gear made of heavy acacia wood, which in turn rotates a vertical wheel festooned with clay pots. As the wheel dips into the Nile and rises again, the pots spill their cargo into a network of mudland channels. You probably wouldn't survive the maintenance on one of these things. One slip of a gear or a snapped rope and you're dealing with a molten wooden machine that has no safety features and a very long memory for mistakes. The introduction of the Sakia is the mainstream historical fact that changed everything for Nubia. Before this technology arrived from the north during the Roman period and was perfected under the Christian kings, the Nubians were at the mercy of the annual flood. If the Nile didn't rise high enough, the crops failed. But with the Sakia, you see the kingdoms expanding their reach. They can now lift water several meters above the river's natural level, turning the high terraces land that had been barren for millennia into lush groves of date palms, barley, and cotton. It is the technological lungs of the empire. Without that constant creak thump, the cities of Dongola and Soba would simply blow away into the sand. But here's a quirky tidbit. The Sakia wasn't just a tool, it was a social unit. Because a water wheel required constant labor, oxen to be fed, gears to be greased with animal fat, and channels to be cleared of silt, villages were organized around the wheels. In old Nubian legal documents, land wasn't just measured in square meters, it was measured in shares of a wheel. You might hear a farmer arguing with his neighbor not about a fence line, but about who's responsible for the third pot on the left. It's a society where your status is directly tied to a groaning wooden circle. And the most important man in the village isn't the one with the biggest sword, but the one who knows how to fix the central axle without it shattering. Historians still argue whether the Sakia led to the centralization of the Nubian state, or if it was the state that forced the adoption of the Sakia to pay for its massive cathedrals. Either way, you see the result in the vibrant green ribbon that hugs the river. You walk through a garden of pomegranate trees and grapevines, feeling the temperature drop by 10 degrees the moment you step under the canopy. It's an artificial Eden. You see a young boy sitting on the horizontal beam of the wheel, singing a song to the oxen to keep them moving. It's a slow, mournful tune that seems to match the pace of the desert. He waves at you, his skin dusted with the fine silt of the Nile, and you realize that this is the real power of the kingdom, not the archers, but the irrigation. You notice that the water isn't just for food, it's for life in every sense. In the monastery nearby, the monks use a smaller version of the wheel to fill a stone basin for ritual washing. You see the children splashing in the overflow of the canals, their laughter cutting through the heavy afternoon heat. However, there's a constant battle here. The desert is always trying to reclaim this land. You see a wall of sand at the edge of the field, held back only by a thin line of acacia trees and the constant, wet vigilance of the farmers. It's a fragile victory, won every single day, one bucket at a time. As the oxen are unhitched for their midday rest, the sudden silence is startling. It's as if the heartbeat of the land has stopped. You sit on the edge of a dry channel, watching the water soak into the thirsty earth, turning it a deep, rich chocolate brown. You think about the engineering required to build these things without modern tools, calculating the torque of the gears, the weight of the water-filled pots, and the stamina of the animals. It's a triumph of human persistence. The sun reaches its zenith, and the world goes still. Even the birds seem to stop singing. You take a sip of lukewarm water, tasting the same minerals that are currently feeding the barley stalks around you. You realize that the Nubian Christian kingdoms didn't just survive because of their faith or their walls. They survived because they learned how to make the dessert drink. As long as the sakia keeps turning, the cross will stay atop the cathedral, and the king will stay on his throne. You lean back against the cool mud brick of a garden wall, the smell of damp earth filling your senses, waiting for the afternoon breeze to signal the restart of the wheel. The heat of the afternoon has softened into a golden haze, and you find yourself seeking the quiet sanctuary of a scriptorium, attached to a monastery in Makuria. Inside, the air is still and smells of dried papyrus, old leather, and the sharp tang of irongal ink. You watch a scribe hunched over a wooden desk, his fingers stained black. He isn't writing in the Latin you might expect from a medieval church, nor just the Greek of the Byzantine elite. He is writing in Old Nubian. This is the language of the land, a unique and sophisticated script that blends the Greek alphabet with characters borrowed from the ancient Meroitic tongue. You probably wouldn't survive the apprenticeship here. The precision required to shave a reed pen to the perfect point, and the patience to hand-letter a 500-page prayer book in a room where the sweat drips onto your parchment would break most modern spirits. The existence of the Old Nubian script is a mainstream historical fact that underscores the kingdom as intellectual independence. While many neighboring cultures eventually saw their local languages swallowed by the spread of Arabic, the Nubians did something bold. They took the language they spoke in the streets and turned it into a literary powerhouse. They used it for everything: high-level diplomatic letters, intricate legal contracts regarding land ownership, and deeply personal religious devotionals. It allowed the common person to feel a direct connection to their faith and their government. You see a stack of tax receipts in the corner, written on broken pieces of pottery called a straka. Even a mundane thing like a grain delivery was recorded in this elegant, flowing script, proving that literacy wasn't just for the ivory tower. But here, as a quirky tidbit, the Nubians were early adopters of shorthand and slang in their writing. Archaeologists have found private letters where the scribes use abbreviations and stylized symbols that look almost like modern emojis to convey tone or speed up the writing process. In one letter, a traveler complains about the quality of the beer at a roadside inn, using a series of quick strokes that historians interpret as a very medieval way of saying 1 star. Would not recommend. It's a reminder that beneath the grand titles of epoch and king, these were people with the same daily frustrations and small joys that we have. They weren't just icons on a wall. They were people who wrote letters to their moms and complained about the bill. Historians still argue whether the Old Nubian script was a grassroots movement or a top-down mandate from the king to foster a sense of national identity. Regardless of its origin, the script served as a cultural fortress because they had their own way of writing, their own way of keeping records, and their own way of praying. It was much harder for outside influences to erode their identity. You see the scribe now carefully dipping his pen into a horn filled with ink. He is copying a passage from the Gospel of John, but he's translating it into the local idiom, ensuring that the word sounds like it was born on the banks of the Nile, not in a distant Mediterranean city. You notice the materials they use are as local as the language. While they import some parchment, most of their writing is done on high-quality leather or locally produced paper. There's a ruggedness to it. You pick up a discarded scrap and feel the texture. It's thick, durable, and smells faintly of the dessert. This language survived the collapse of empires and the shifting of trade routes because it was literally written into the fabric of daily life. Even as Arabic began to trickle in through trade, Old Nubian remained the language of the heart and the altar. As the scribe finishes a page, he blows gently on the ink to dry it. He looks up at you and smiles, pointing to a specific characterish sound that doesn't exist in Greek, but was essential for the Nubian tongue. He seems proud of that little mark, a small but defiant signal that his people have their own voice. You realize that a kingdom is more than just its walls and its spears. It's the stories it tells itself in its own words. The ability to read and write your own name in your own language is a form of power that no army can truly take away. You leave the scriptorium as the shadows of the date palms stretch across the courtyard. The sound of the monks chanting in the chapel begins, and you can hear the distinct clicks and sh sounds of the Nubian language. weaving through the traditional melodies. It's a beautiful, complex tapestry of sound. You walk toward the river, thinking about how many civilizations have vanished because they left no written record of their inner lives. But the Nubians, they left us their shopping lists, their prayers, and their complaints about bad beer. They made sure they would be heard. Even 1,000 years later, the morning air is crisp, but the horizon is already shimmering with the promise of a brutal noon. You aren't by the river today. Instead, you've ventured into the Baqt Desert, a vast, sun-scorched triangle of land that shortcuts the Great Bend of the Nile. You are traveling with a caravan, a moving city of swaying camels, shouting men, and the rhythmic clink-clink of metal harness rings. You probably wouldn't survive the first 48 hours of this trek on your own. The desert doesn't just lack water. It actively tries to suck the moisture out of your marrow. You have to know the exact location of every hidden well and cistern, some of which are nothing more than a damp patch of sand that requires 3 hours of digging. One wrong turn, one sandstorm that erases the faint track, and you become part of the landscape's cautionary tales. You are witnessing the economic engine that funds those granite cathedrals you saw in Dongola. This is the Great Desert Trade Route. The mainstream historical fact is that Nubia was the indispensable middleman of the medieval world. They controlled the flow of African prestige goods, gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animal skins moving toward the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. But it wasn't a one-way street. These caravans are returning with luxury items that the Nubian elite crave: incense from South Arabia, spices from India, and fine silks. You see a merchant carefully adjusting the load on a lead camel. He's carrying red gold, the high-purity dust pant from the riverbeds of the Blue Nile and the Red Sea hills. It's the currency of empires, and it's all passing through Nubian hands. But here's a quirky tidbit: the most valuable commodity on this caravan might actually be salt. In a world without refrigeration, salt was literally life. You see massive slabs of it, gray and crystalline, wrapped in rough palm fiber mats. It was often traded weight for weight with gold in certain parts of the interior. You might find it funny that the king would trade his precious metal for something you shake onto your fries for free. But in the 9th century, if you didn't have salt, your army didn't move and your food didn't keep. It was the strategic reserve of the Middle Ages, and the Nubian control over the routes to the salt pans was as vital as their control over the Nile itself. Historians still argue whether the Nubian kings operated a royal monopoly on this trade, or if there was a thriving middle class of private merchants. As you watch the banner between the caravan leader and the royal tax collector at a desert outpost, it seems like a bit of both. The king gets his cut, of course a literal toll of the sands, but the merchants clearly have enough skin in the game to risk their lives in the heat. You notice the diversity of the travelers. There are Nubians in white tunics, Baya nomads from the eastern mountains with their distinctive frizzy hair, and even a few bold Egyptian traders who have the proper passports signed by the Eparch of Faras. The heat becomes a physical presence, a wall of white light that makes the distant mountains look like they are floating. You learn the caravan crawl a steady, energy-saving pace that ignores the desire to run for shade that isn't there. You see the ruins of an old Meroitic station, its stones half buried by a wandering dune. Even centuries ago, people were plying this same route. The Nubians didn't invent these paths, they perfected the logistics of them. They built fortified wells and small desert churches where travelers could pray for protection against the ghouls and spirits that supposedly haunted the deep sands. As the sun finally begins to drop, the caravan doesn't stop immediately. They push for another hour to reach a specific outcrop of black basalt that offers protection from the wind. The setup of the camp is a marvel of efficiency. Camels are hobbled and fed a few handfuls of dried beans. Fires are lit using dried dung, and the smell of roasting grain and coffee begins to drift through the air. You sit on a pack of ebony logs, feeling the desert chill move in the moment the sun vanishes. It's a violent swing in temperature, from a furnace to a refrigerator in less than an hour. You watch the stars come out, and out here, they aren't just pretty lights, they are the GPS of the 800s. The caravan leader is pointing out the constellations to a younger apprentice, showing him how to navigate by the unfailing lights. You realize that the Nubian kingdoms weren't just Nile-centric. They were masters of the void between the waters. They owned the desert because they understood its rules. You take a sip of strong bitter tea, feeling the grit of the day's travel between your teeth, and realize that every stone in the cathedrals of Dongola was paid for by the sweat of these camels and the bravery of the men who dared to walk the belly of stones. You are heading south, deeper into the interior of Africa than most medieval travelers would ever dare to dream. The landscape is changing. The harsh golden sands of the northern deserts are giving way to a more hospitable savanna, where acacia trees dot the horizon and the air feels thicker laden with the scent of wild grasses and the damp breath of the Blue Nile. You are approaching Soba, the legendary capital of Alodia. If Makuria is the grit and the muscle of the Nubian world, Alodia is its refined, golden soul. As the city walls come into view, you see why the Arab traveler Ibn Selim al-Aswani spoke of this place with such reverence. It isn't just a city, it's a garden. You see sprawling estates irrigated by hundreds of sakia wheels, and the skyline is a forest of red brick domes and whitewashed towers. You probably wouldn't survive the luxury here. Honestly, the pace of life is slower, the food is richer, and the political intrigues in the Golden City are far more dangerous than a desert sandstorm. As you pass through the gates, the sheer scale of the architecture hits you. While Dongola was built for defense, Soba was built for display. You see churches with floors of polished marble and walls inlaid with mother of pearl and gold leaf. One mainstream historical fact about Alodia is its incredible wealth and longevity. It remained a powerful Christian entity long after the northern kingdoms began to struggle. The city of Soba served as a massive hub for trade from the Ethiopian highlands and the heart of the continent. Historians still argue whether Alodia was more influenced by its northern Nubian cousins or the powerful Aksumite Empire to the east. But standing in the main square, you see a culture that has synthesized both into something uniquely Alodian. But here's a quirky tidbit. The people of Soba were reportedly obsessed with exotic pets. Travelers wrote about seeing tame lions and leopards lounging in the courtyards of the wealthy. And the king was said to have a collection of birds from the deep south, whose feathers were used to create the most vibrant liturgical vestments in the world. You might find it funny that a high-ranking bishop would walk into a cathedral looking like a tropical parrot, but in Soba, color was a sign of divine favor. If your robes didn't shimmer with the iridescence of a sunbird's wing, were you even really praying? You notice the religious life here is slightly different from the north. There is a Southern Cross energy a bit more mystical, perhaps a bit more influenced by the ancient traditions of the savannah. You walk past a monastery, where the monks are practicing a form of rhythmic chanting accompanied by large, hide-covered drums. It's a deep, thrumming sound that resonates in your chest, a far cry from the delicate Greek hymns of Pharos. The faith here has deep roots, and it's intertwined with the cycles of the tropical rains. You see people leaving offerings of grain and milk at the church doors, a tradition that likely predates the arrival of the cross, but has been seamlessly folded into the Christian life. The market in Soba is a sensory explosion. You see merchants selling civet, a potent musk used in perfumes, alongside mounds of frankincense and stacks of leopard skins. There are traders here from as far away as the Swahili coast, bringing news of the Indian Ocean trade. You realize that Soba is the southern anchor of a vast network. It is the gatekeeper of the interior. You watch a group of Alodian nobles passing by on horseback. They are tall, striking figures in flowing silk tunics, their horses decked out in silver-mounted harness. There is an air of supreme confidence here. They are the masters of the island of Meroe, the fertile land between the two Niles. As the sun begins to set, the light reflects off the gilded crosses of the many churches. Some sources say there were over 400 in Soba alone, creating a shimmering city of light. In the middle of the African plain, you find a quiet spot in one of the city's many gardens, near a fountain that splashes cool water into a basin of green malahite. The sound of the drums from the monastery continues, a steady heartbeat for the city. It's hard to believe that this place is so far removed from the Mediterranean. It feels like the center of its own universe. You take a bite of a sweet, honeyed cake made from finger millet. Watching the fireflies begin to dance over the irrigation canals, you realize that Alodia is the ultimate proof of the Nubian success story. They didn't just survive at the edge of the world. They built a civilization of staggering beauty and complexity in a place where everyone else thought the world simply ended. But you also notice a few more soldiers on the walls than usual, and the whispers in the market mention the rising power of nomadic tribes to the east. For now, the golden city shines, but the shadows of the savannah are long, and the future is never as certain as the rising of the Nile. The dust of the southern road still clings to your cloak as you cross back into the heart of Makuria, but you notice something has changed in the political atmosphere. The air feels heavier, more certain. You are witnessing the great unification. Sometime in the 7th or 8th century, the northern kingdom of Nobatia and its southern neighbor Makuria ceased to be rivals and merged into a single, formidable superpower under the banner of the Makurian kings. This wasn't a bloody conquest, but a strategic marriage of necessity and shared faith. You probably wouldn't survive the bureaucratic headache of this merger. Imagine trying to synchronize two different legal systems to sets of regional governors, and 1,000 years of who owns which cataract grudges, all while the Caliphate to the north is watching for any sign of weakness. The mainstream historical fact of this union is that it transformed the Nile Valley into a fortress. By centralizing power in Old Dongola, the Nubians created a unified front that stretched from the border of Egypt all the way to the edges of Alodia. This was the golden age of the Christian Nile, with the administrative skills of the Nobatians and the agricultural muscle of the Makurians. The kingdom became the most stable state in Africa. Historians still argue whether Nobatia was annexed or if it became a semi-autonomous province, ruled by the Eparch of Faras, who acted as a sort of viceroy. Regardless, when you look at the official seals on government documents now, you see the authority of one king, one church, and one people. But here's a quirky tidbit to cement this new national identity. The Nubians became obsessed with genealogical marketing. You see royal inscriptions and church frescoes that suddenly go into obsessive detail about how the king of Dongola is related to the old heroes of the north. It's like a medieval version of a PR campaign. They even started building commemorative churches in former Nobatian territory that looked exactly like the ones in the south, just to remind everyone who was in charge. You might find it funny that even 1,200 years ago politicians knew that if you want people to accept a new government, you just have to build a bunch of shiny new infrastructure and tell them it was their idea all along. You notice the benefits of this unification as you walk through a bustling river port. There is a new level of standardized trade. The pottery styles of the north and south have begun to blend, creating a national style of beautiful, orange-slipped ware decorated with Christian symbols and now flowers. You see a merchant from Faras trading with a farmer from the Fourth Cataract, and they are using the same units of measure and the same currency of grain and gold. The kingdom is humming with the energy of a machine that finally has all its parts working in sync. The king, now ruling from the massive throne hall in Dongola, has become a figure of continental importance. He isn't just a local chieftain. He is the protector of the Coptic faith. You see messengers arriving from the Patriarch of Alexandria, seeking the king's intervention when the Christian minority in Egypt faces trouble. This unified Nubia has enough military heft that even the powerful governors of Cairo have to think twice before breaking the terms of the Baqt. You feel a sense of security here that was missing when the kingdoms were fractured. The archers of the eyes now have a single command structure, and their reach is long. However, unification brings its own set of tensions. You overhear a group of Nobatian nobles grumbling in a tavern about the southern bias of the court in Dongola. They miss the days when Faras was the center of the world. It's a classic case of regional pride clashing with national unity. But then, a priest walks in and begins a prayer in Old Nubian, and the room falls silent. The shared faith is the glue that fills the cracks of these political grievances. They might argue about taxes, but they will die for the same cross. As the sun sets over the unified Nile, you see the signal fires being lit on the hilltops, a chain of light that can carry a message from the Egyptian border to the heart of the kingdom in a single night. This is the infrastructure of an empire. You realize that by joining forces, Nobatia and Makuria didn't just survive, they thrived. They turned a collection of river settlements into a cohesive civilization that could look the rest of the world in the eye. You take a seat on the riverbank, watching a royal barge glide past. It's dozens of oars moving in perfect, unified rhythm. It's a powerful metaphor for the kingdom itself, many parts, one direction, and a lot of muscle behind the movement. The dust of the Nile Valley is one thing, but the salt spray of the Mediterranean is a distant dream for most. Yet here you are standing on the docks of a delta port in Egypt, watching a group of travelers who look strikingly out of place. They are tall, wrapped in heavy, embroidered woolen cloaks despite the humidity, and they carry staves topped with the distinct four-armed crosses of the south. These are Nubian pilgrims. You are witnessing a mainstream historical fact that often surprises people. The Nubian kingdoms maintained a permanent, vibrant presence in the Holy Land and the great monasteries of Egypt for centuries. They weren't isolated in their desert fortress. They were international travelers of the highest order. You probably wouldn't survive the logistics of this trip. It involves navigating the no-man's land of the northern border, securing safe passage from the Muslim governors in Cairo, and surviving the shipborne diseases of the Levant, all while carrying enough gold to fund a year-long round trip. As you follow them into the winding streets of Jerusalem, you see them head toward the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There, the Nubians don't just visit, they have their own designated chapels and residential quarters within the holy city. Historians still argue whether this presence was a result of the Nubian king's immense wealth, or a diplomatic concession by the Caliphate to keep the archers of the eyes happy and peaceful on their southern border. Regardless, when you see a Nubian bishop officiating a service in the heart of Jerusalem speaking Old Nubian under the same roof as Greeks, Latins, and Armenians, you realize that the now kingdom saw themselves as central players in the global Christian drama. But here, as a quirky tidbit, the Nubians were famous, or perhaps infamous, among other pilgrims, for their souvenir habits. They didn't just buy olive wood crosses, they were known for leaving their own mark. Archaeologists have found Nubian inscriptions scratched into the stones of holy sites across the Middle East. It's like they were obsessed with proving to the world that the sons of Cush had returned to the land of the Bible. You might find it funny that a group of pious monks would spend their afternoon essentially tagging a 1,000-year-old wall, but for them, it was a way of claiming a spiritual inheritance that stretched back to the Queen of Sheba and the Ethiopian eunuch of the Book of Acts. You notice that these pilgrimages were also intelligentsia missions. When the pilgrims returned to Dongola or Soba, they didn't just bring back holy water and relics, they brought back news of the world. They talked about the rise and fall of viziers in Cairo, the movement of Turkish mercenaries in the north, and the shifting fashions of the Byzantine court. The king's palace in Makuria was likely better informed about Mediterranean politics than many European courts of the same era. You see a returning pilgrim showing a small, intricate glass vial from Damascus to a group of Wydid locals. To them, it's a piece of another world, proof that their faith links them to a vast, shimmering somewhere else. There is a deep sense of pride in this connection. You walk through a Nubian monastery in the Cetus Valley of Egypt, known as the Monastery of the Syrians, where Nubian monks lived alongside Egyptians and Syrians. You see them working in the library, translating Greek texts into Old Nubian. This was a brain drain in reverse. The best and brightest of the now kingdoms were sent abroad to master the wisdom of the wider world, only to bring it back to the desert. It kept the culture from stagnating. It ensured that even when the desert winds tried to bury the cities of the Nile, the intellectual life of the kingdoms remained part of the global flow. As you sit in a courtyard in Jerusalem watching the sunset over the domes of the city, you see a Nubian pilgrim sharing a meal of dried dates and bread with a Frankish knight who has just arrived from Europe. They can't speak each other's language, but they both point to the cross around their necks and nod. It's a moment of profound, wordless connection. The Nubian isn't a stranger here. He is a co-religionist, a fellow citizen of the faith. The journey back home will take months, and many of these pilgrims will never see the Nile again, succumbing to the hardships of the road. But for those who do return, they are treated like heroes. They bring with them the blessing of the holy places, and for a few weeks, the entire village will gather to hear stories of the great marble cities and the Sapphire Sea. You realize that the Nubian kingdoms weren't just defending a territory, they were defending their right to belong to the world. You take a final look at the Nubian chapel, the smell of African incense mixing with the Mediterranean air, and you feel the immense scale of the world they navigated. The political weather is shifting. You are back in the dusty streets of Old Dongola, but the gossip in the marketplace has taken on a sharper, more urgent tone. The news from the north is that the old order in Egypt has been swept away. The Umayyad Caliphate, a powerful Shia dynasty coming out of the west, has seized Cairo and declared themselves the true leaders of the Islamic world. For the Nubian kingdoms, this is a moment of profound uncertainty. You probably wouldn't survive the diplomatic tightrope walk required here. The Fatimids are sophisticated, fabulously wealthy, and they have a very different vision for the Red Sea trade than their predecessors. One wrong word in a letter to the new caliph, and that 600-year-old Baqt Treaty might just become a very expensive scrap of papyrus. A mainstream historical fact of this era is that the relationship between Christian Nubia and Fatimid Egypt became one of the most fascinating frenemy dynamics in the Middle Ages. The Fatimids were obsessed with prestige, and they realized that having a stable, Christian neighbor to the south who provided gold and elite soldiers was better than having a chaotic war zone. You see Fatimid ambassadors arriving in Dongola, not with threats, but with gifts of robes of honor made of Dabaki silk and elaborate perfumes. Historians still argue whether the Fatimids genuinely respected the Nubian sovereignty, or if they were simply too distracted by their wars with the Abbasids and the Byzantines to bother with a southern invasion. Regardless, the border at Aswan becomes a bustling hub of official smuggling and high-stakes diplomacy. But here as a quirky tidbit, the Fatimid caliphs became so fond of Nubian soldiers that they formed an elite palace guard made entirely of Sudan black African troops. These men weren't just muscle, they became a powerful political faction in Cairo. You might find it funny that a Christian kingdom was essentially exporting the bodyguards for a Muslim caliph, but in the medieval world, loyalty was often more important than theology. There are stories of these Nubian guards in Cairo sending money back home to build churches in their home villages along the Nile. It's a bizarre, circular flow of wealth. Fatimid taxes paying for Nubian soldiers, who then pay for Christian liturgy. You notice a change in the goods coming down the river. The Fatimids have brought a new level of aesthetic refinement. You see lusterware pottery from Cairo ceramics that shimmer like metal being traded for Nubian leopard skins and gold dust. The Nubian elite are quick to adopt these new luxuries. You see a high-ranking eparch wearing a Fatimid-style turban over his traditional Christian robes. It's a visual mashup that perfectly captures the era. They are still staunchly Christian, but they are increasingly part of a Nile Valley culture that transcends religious boundaries. However, the cold peace has its cracks. You walk past the border station at Qasr Ibram, a massive fortress perched on a cliff overlooking the Nile. The garrison here has been doubled. The Fatimids are ambitious, and they've begun to push their influence into the Red Sea, potentially bypassing the Nubian land routes. You see the Nubian officers watching the horizon with narrowed eyes. They know that the Fatimids are missionary by nature. They want to spread their specific branch of Islam. For now, the gold keeps the peace, but the air feels like the moment before a desert thunderstorm, heavy, still, and charged with static. In the churches of Makuria, the prayers for the safety of the borders have become more fervent. You hear the priests invoking the names of the ancient warriors, asking for protection against the lions of the north. You realize that the Nubians are masters of the long game. They've survived the Rashidun, the Umayyads, and the Abbasids. They see the Fatimids as just another season in the long history of the river. But you also notice that the Nubian king is spending more time reviewing his archers and less time in the scriptorium. As the sun sets, casting a long, blood-red reflection across the water, you see a Fatimid trade galley heading north, laden with tusks and gold. On the shore, a Nubian priest stands in the shadow of a stone cross, silently watching it go. It's a picture of two worlds in a delicate, profitable, and terrifying embrace. You find a spot on the riverbank and listen to the water lapping against the stones. The Nile doesn't care who sits on the throne in Cairo or Dongola. It just keeps flowing. But for the people living on its banks, the arrival of the Fatimids has changed the stakes of the game forever. The horizon to the north is no longer just shimmering with the heat of the Fatimid courts. It is vibrating with a rumor that sounds like a fantasy. Word has reached the markets of old Dongola that a sea of ironclad warriors from the land of the Franks has descended upon the Levant. You are witnessing the ripples of the Crusades as they reach the Middle Nile. To the Nubian kings, this is a moment of dizzying confusion and sudden, desperate hope. Imagine the shock of hearing that the holy city of Jerusalem, where your pilgrims have prayed for centuries, is now held by men who wear the same cross as you but look and speak like no one you've ever seen. You probably wouldn't survive the political fallout of this era. The tension between wanting to support your fellow Christians and needing to maintain the pact with the disgruntled Muslim rulers in Cairo is a recipe for a diplomatic execution. A mainstream historical fact of this period is that the Crusades fundamentally altered the Nubian worldview. For the first time, they realized they weren't the only ones fighting to keep the cross relevant in the East. Historians still argue whether there was ever a formal secret alliance between the Nubian kings and the Crusaders. Some medieval European chronicles mention a legendary Prester John, a powerful Christian king in the East who would one day march his armies north to crush the Islamic caliphates. While we know now that Prester John was a myth, the Nubians were the closest thing to a reality that fit the description. You see the king of Makuria receiving a clandestine messenger from the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, and the air in the palace is thick with the what-ifs of history. But here as a quirky tidbit, the Crusaders were just as confused about the Nubians as the Nubians were about them. European knights who encountered Nubian pilgrims in Jerusalem described them as men of great stature, black as coal, but with the most refined manners and the fiercest devotion. There is a rumor that the Crusaders actually invited Nubian archers to join their ranks because of their legendary reputation. You might find it funny to imagine a Ramat el-Haduk standing on the walls of Acre, alongside a French knight, complaining about the humidity and the lack of decent sorghum beer. It's a collision of worlds that felt like a glitch in the medieval matrix. You notice a shift in the local iconography. In the small village churches along the Nile, the frescoes of saints start to look a bit more knightly. St. George and St. Mercurius, always popular in Nubia, are now depicted with shields and spears that look suspiciously like the gear used by the Franks. It's a subtle way of expressing solidarity. You feel a sense of long-distance kinship. The Nubians start to see their struggle not as an isolated desert survival story, but as the southern front of a global holy war. However, the reality on the ground remains brutal. The Crusades made the rulers of Egypt, now transitioning from the Fatimids to the Iron-Willed, Saladin and his Ayyubid dynasty, extremely paranoid. They began to look at their southern Christian neighbor not as a trade partner, but as a potential fifth column that could stab them in the back. You walk through the streets of Dongola and see that the mood has darkened. The trade galleys are fewer, and the tax collectors are more aggressive. The cold peace of the Baqt is starting to freeze over into something much more dangerous. In the cathedral, the Bishop of Dongola reads a letter from the Patriarch of Alexandria, urging the Nubians to remain calm and avoid provoking the Ayyubids. But the young nobles in the back of the church are whispering about the Great Crossing. They want to march north and join the fight. You realize that the Crusades gave the Nubians a vision of a world where they weren't alone, but it also painted a target on their backs. The dream of a unified Christian front from the North Sea to the Blue Nile was a beautiful one, but the geography of the desert is an unforgiving critic. As the sun sets, casting long, spur-like shadows across the plaza, you see a group of pilgrims departing for the north. They carry letters for the Christian lords of the Levant, hidden in the soles of their sandals. They are walking into a firestorm, driven by a faith that has been renewed by the news of the Frankish cross. You watch them vanish into the haze, wondering if they seek a kingdom of this world or the next. The Nile flows on, indifferent to the shifting crusades of men, but the hearts of the Nubians are now beating to a rhythm that is being set thousands of miles away. While the men are off debating the logistics of holy wars and desert trade, you step back into the cool, shaded courtyards of the royal residences, where the real power often resides. You are entering the world of the Nubian women. In many medieval societies, women are ghosts in the historical record, but here in Nubia, they are the pillars. You notice a woman of middle age walking with a group of attendants. She wears a heavy silver pectoral and a robe of fine Egyptian linen. This isn't just a royal wife. She is the Kandaka title that stretches back to the ancient queens of Meroe. You probably wouldn't survive a political debate with her. The Nubian court is a matrilineal maze where the king's mother or sister often holds more sway over the line of succession than the king himself. The mainstream historical fact that defines this society is its matrilineal descent. In Makuria and Alodia, the crown didn't necessarily pass from father to son, but from the king to the son of his sister. This kept power rooted in a specific female bloodline. Historians still argue whether this was a survival of ancient African divine motherhood, or a practical way to ensure the royal blood remained pure in a world of shifting alliances. When you look at the legal documents found in the sands, you see women owning land, initiating court cases, and managing their own wealth independently of their husbands. It is a level of female agency that would have left a European knight or a Coptic monk from the north scratching his head in confusion. But here, as a quirky tidbit, the Nubian queens were the ultimate power dressers of the medieval world. While the men were often restricted by the sober white linens of their priestly or military roles, the royal women used their bodies as canvases for political messaging. They wore massive, intricate tattoos on their forearms and chests, often geometric patterns or religious symbols, and their jewelry was a mix of Christian crosses and ancient protective amulets. You might find it funny that the woman basically running the domestic policy of a Christian empire was also wearing good luck charms that dated back to the time of Ramses. But in Nubia, tradition wasn't something you discarded. It was something you layered. You follow one of these high-ranking women into a local church. She isn't sitting in a hidden gallery. She is a prominent patron. You see a fresco on the wall that she commissioned. It depicts her standing tall, draped in a magnificent, patterned shawl, with the Virgin Mary placing a hand on her shoulder. This Queen Mother figure was often the chief diplomat of the kingdom. While the king dealt with the archers of the eyes, she dealt with the social fabric, the marriages that bound noble houses together. and the management of the massive church estates. She was the anchor of the state. There's a quiet strength in the way the household is run. You see the Queen Mother consulting with a group of female scribes. Yes, literacy wasn't just for the monks. They are reviewing the accounts of a royal vineyard. You realize that the stability of Nubia for 800 years wasn't just due to the walls of Dongola. It was due to this unbroken chain of mothers and daughters who held the memory of the kingdom. They were the ones who ensured that even if a king fell in battle, the identity of the people remained intact. As evening approaches, you see the women gathering in the central courtyard to listen to a storyteller. They aren't just hearing fairy tales. They are hearing the king lists and the histories of their ancestors. It's an oral archive that supplements the written records of the monasteries. You notice the respect the younger men show to these matriarchs in Nubia. To insult a man's mother wasn't just a personal slight. It was a challenge to his very right to exist in the social order. The sun sets, and the Queen Mother retires to her inner chambers. You find a spot by a stone pillar, watching the lanterns flicker out one by one. You think about how much of this history has been told through the eyes of male travelers and soldiers, often missing the heartbeat of the home. But here, in the silence of the palace, you feel the presence of these powerful women. They are the silent architects of the 800-year resistance. You take a final look at the darkened courtyard, the scent of jasmine and wood smoke lingering in the air, knowing that as long as the sisters of the king were strong, the kingdom of the Nile would never truly fall. The air in the 13th century has grown sharp, and the comfortable cold peace of the Baqt is finally beginning to shatter under the weight of a new, ruthless power in the north. You are standing in a border outpost near the Second Cataract, and the messengers arriving from Cairo no longer carry the refined silks of the Fatimids or the diplomatic pleas of the Ayyubids. They carry the iron-fisted demands of the Mamluks. These are the slave sultans, elite Turkic warrior caste members who have seized the throne of Egypt and have absolutely zero patience for ancient treaties or archers of the eyes. You probably wouldn't survive the first meeting with a Mamluk envoy. They don't negotiate so much as they issue ultimatums backed by the finest heavy cavalry in the world. A mainstream historical fact that marks this turning point is the rise of Sultan Baybars. After crushing the Mongols at Ain Jalut and driving the Crusaders into the sea, he turned his gaze south. He saw the Christian kingdoms not as respected neighbors, but as a tributary state that was falling behind on its payments. Historians still argue whether the Mamluk aggression was fueled by a desire for Nubian gold or a strategic need to secure their southern flank against a possible Christian-Mongol alliance. Either way, the Sultan and the king dynamic shifted from a handshake to a chokehold. You see the Nubian King David making a bold, perhaps suicidal, move. He stops the Baqt payments and launches a preemptive strike on the Egyptian port of Adhab. But here's a quirky tidbit. The Mamluks were so frustrated by the Nubian terrain that they tried to modernize their invasion by bringing in specialized desert scouts from the Bedouin tribes. However, the Nubians countered this by using their knowledge of the Nile's hidden channels. There are stories of Nubian saboteurs swimming out to Mamluk supply ships in the middle of the night, not with swords, but with jars of aggressive river hornets to release below deck. You might find it funny that the world's most elite cavalry was defeated by a bunch of angry insects, but in the guerrilla war of the cataracts, the Nubians used every biological weapon the river provided. You notice that the king of Makuria is no longer just a priest king. He has become a desperate general. He is spending the kingdom's dwindling gold reserves to hire mercenaries from the southern tribes. The unity of the Golden Age is fraying. You walk through the streets of Dongola and see the scars of the first Mamluk raids: burned granaries and breached walls. The Mamluks have something the Rashidun didn't: better logistics and a relentless, professional military machine that doesn't care about the heat. They aren't looking for a treaty. They are looking for a puppet. The diplomatic letters of this era are heartbreaking. You see the Nubian scribes trying to use the old Byzantine-style flowery language to appeal to the Sultan's honor, but the replies from Cairo are short and brutal. Pay the tribute, or we will turn the Nile red. The prestige of the archers of the eyes is being tested by the Mamluk crossbows and heavy armor. You feel the weight of a world closing in. The isolation that once protected Nubia is now becoming its prison. In the great church, the mood is somber. The king priest still leads the liturgy, but his voice shakes. He knows that his cousin is currently in Cairo, whispering to the Sultan and offering to become a Muslim puppet king in exchange for the throne. This internal treachery is the poison in the well. The Mamluks realize they don't have to conquer Nubia. They just have to sponsor the right civil war. You see the faces of the people in the pews. They are tired, hungry, and looking toward the north with a fear that their ancestors never knew. As the sun sets, casting long, jagged shadows over the palace, you hear the distant sound of drums, not the rhythmic Alodian drums of the south, but the war drums of the Mamluk vanguard. They are coming. You find a spot on the ramparts and look out at the river, which looks like a silver vein in the dark. The 800-year streak of independence is on the line. You realize that the Sultan and the king aren't just two men fighting. They are two eras colliding. One is the last gasp of the ancient Mediterranean African world, and the other is the rising tide of the militant Islamic Middle Ages. You take a deep breath, the smell of dust and impending rain in the air, knowing that the next few years will decide the fate of the cross on the Nile. The cracks are no longer just in the walls of the outer fortresses. They have reached the very foundations of the royal house in Old Dongola. You are standing in the great hall, and the air is thick with a tension that feels far more dangerous than any Mamluk sword. You are witnessing the internal fracture, the matrilineal system of succession, which for centuries provided a stable and unique continuity, has suddenly become a weapon in the hands of the ambitious. You probably wouldn't survive the political minefield of this court. Brothers are eyeing their sisters' sons with murderous suspicion, and the king's advisors are taking bribes from the north to support rival claimants. The unity that defined the 800-year resistance is dissolving into a chaotic scramble for a crumbling throne. A mainstream historical fact of this period is that the kingdom of Makuria began to disintegrate, not just from external pressure, but from a series of devastating succession disputes. When a king died, instead of a smooth transition, the palace became a theater of civil war. Historians still argue whether this was a natural decline of an aging system, or if the Mamluk Sultanate deliberately stoked these fires by hosting pretenders to the throne in Cairo, giving them gold and soldiers to return home and cause havoc. You see a young prince, a nephew of the reigning king, riding out of the city gates under the cover of darkness. He isn't fleeing. He's heading to Egypt to sell his loyalty for a chance to wear the crown. But here's a quirky tidbit. During these chaotic years, the Archers of the Eyes became the most sought-after mercenaries in the region, but they often ended up fighting each other. You might see a squad of veteran bowmen defending a granary for the king, only to be picked off by their own cousins who have been hired by a rebel duke from the Second Cataract. It's a tragic irony. The skill that once held back the caliphates is now being used to hollow out the kingdom from the inside. You might find it funny, in a dark way, that the Nubians were so good at defense that the only people who could actually beat them were themselves. You notice the physical toll this internal strife takes on the capital. The maintenance of the Sakia wheels is being neglected because the farmers are too busy hiding in the hills from marauding factions. The irrigation channels are choking with silt, and the Onsalish gardens of Dongola are turning a brittle, thirsty brown. The state, which once functioned like a well-oiled machine, is now a collection of local warlords and terrified villages. You see a priest standing on the steps of a crumbling church, trying to mediate between two rival noblemen, but they ignore him. The spiritual authority of the monkings has vanished, replaced by the cold logic of the spear. The desert tribes, sensing the weakness of the central government, have begun to move in. These nomadic groups, like the Juhana and the Banu Khans, are no longer just passing through. They are settling on the outskirts of the fertile lands. They aren't an invading army you can meet in a single battle. They are a slow, steady tide. You walk through a market that used to be filled with Mediterranean glass and find it mostly empty, save for a few weary traders selling basic grains. The high culture of the Byzantine connection is a memory. The king, once the protector of the faith, is now little more than the mayor of a besieged city. In the royal scriptorium, the scribes have stopped copying the Gospels. They are now drafting desperate letters of apology to the Sultan in Cairo, pleading for intervention against their own rebellious relatives. It is a humiliating reversal of fortune. You realize that the fracture isn't just political, it's psychological. The belief in a unified Christian Nubia is dying. The people are starting to look for new protectors, new identities, and new ways to survive in a world where the old gods and the old kings have failed them. As the sun sets, casting long, jagged shadows across the cracked pavement of the royal plaza, you hear the sound of a distant wall collapsing. It wasn't knocked down by a catapult. It simply fell over from centuries of neglect and a lack of anyone to care for it. You find a quiet corner to sit, watching the stars come out over a capital that is slowly becoming a ruin. The silence of the night is broken not by hymns, but by the distant, lonely howl of a desert jackal. You realize that the 800-year story is entering its final, fractured act. and no amount of archery or prayer can stitch the kingdom back together now. You are standing in a small village on the outskirts of the Dongola Reach, and if you weren't paying close attention, you might think nothing has changed. The Nile still pulses against the mud banks, and the heat still rings in your ears like a bell. But as you watch the people in the marketplace, you realize you are witnessing a silent revolution. This is the era of the Banu Khans. They aren't an invading army with banners and drums. They are a tribal confederation of Arab origin that has been slowly drifting south for generations. You probably wouldn't survive the cultural complexity of this transition. It is a world of gray zones where your neighbor might pray to a different god but share your grandmother's lineage. The 800-year-old wall of the frontier hasn't been knocked down, it's been walked through. A mainstream historical fact of this period is the process of cultural and biological osmosis. The Banu Khans and other tribes like the Juhana began to integrate into Nubian society through the most effective conquest tool in history, marriage. Because Nubian society was matrilineal, an Arab man who married a Nubian noblewoman would see his children inherit her land and her status. However, those children often carried the faith and the language of their fathers. Historians still argue whether this was a deliberate strategy of soft conquest by the Arab tribes, or simply a natural result of the breakdown of the central Makurian state. Regardless, you see the result in the faces of the children playing in the dust, a new synthesis of the Nile, and the desert is being born right before your eyes. But here as a quirky tidbit, this transition led to some of the strangest legal disputes in medieval history. You might overhear a court case where a man is trying to claim a Sakia wheel based on his mother's Christian inheritance rights, while simultaneously arguing for a tax exemption based on his father's Islamic tribal status. It was the ultimate have your cake and eat it too strategy. You might find it funny that the high-stakes theology of the past has been replaced by people haggling over the fine print of two different worldviews just to keep their date groves. It's a messy, human, and surprisingly peaceful way for one world to fade into another. You notice that the archers of the eyes are still here, but they are no longer guarding the king's palace. They are guarding their own families. Many of the legendary Nubian bowmen have taken service with the tribal chiefs of the Banu Khans. The military skill of the Nubians is being absorbed into the tribal structure of the newcomers. You see a veteran archer teaching a young Arab boy how to hold a composite bow. The boy is wearing a desert robe, but he's speaking a dialect that still has the rhythmic clicks of old Nubian. The cultural fortress is leaking, and the water is mixing with the sand. The presence of the Banu Khans changed the economics of the river. They brought with them a focus on pastoralism, sheep and goats that often clashed with the settled, water-wheel-dended agriculture of the Christian Nubians. You walk past a field where the irrigation channels have been trampled by a herd of goats, and you see a Nubian farmer arguing with a nomad. This is the new front line. It's not a war of empires, it's a war of how do we use this land. The central government in Dongola is too weak to intervene, so the locals are forced to make their own deals, their own marriages, and their own peace. In the village church, the pews are thinning. It is not that people are being forced to convert. The Banu Khans are surprisingly pragmatic, but the social prestige has shifted. To get ahead in this new, tribal world, it helps to speak Arabic and follow the laws of the north. You see a young man who was baptized as George now asking people to call him Ahmad when he goes to the market. It's a slow, quiet drift. The bells still ring for Sunday service, but the sound is increasingly drowned out by the call to prayer from a small, mud-brick mosque built by a tribal leader. As the sun sets, casting a hazy, golden light over the mingling herds and haystacks, you realize that this is how empires actually end, not with a bang, but with a wedding feast. The 800-year resistance didn't fail because the archers ran out of arrows. It ended because the people found a new way to live. You find a spot by the river, watching the two cultures interact with a wary but necessary respect. The Nile flows through the heart of it all, indifferent to whether the man drinking its water calls himself a son of the church or a son of the tribe. You take a final look at the village, where the light of a church candle and the light of a nomadic campfire flicker side by side. In the gathering dark, you are standing on a ridge overlooking the great bend of the Nile, and the sight before you is one of profound, haunting stillness. The year is 1323 CE, and you are looking down at old Dongola. But this isn't the vibrant, granite-walled metropolis you visited centuries ago. The granite heart of Makuria has stopped beating. The city that once defied the Rashidun Caliphate and the Mamluk sultans has finally succumbed, not to a single catastrophic explosion, But to a slow, agonizing strangulation of civil war and puppet kings, you probably wouldn't survive. The despair of this place, the air feels heavy with the scent of abandonment, and the Grand Throne Hall, where you once saw kings dressed in Byzantine silk, is now being picked apart by scavengers. The mainstream historical fact of this tragedy is the official end of the Christian monarchy in 1323, after decades of Mamluk-sponsored coups. The last Christian king, Kenz al-Dawla, who, ironically, was a member of the Banu Kenz tribe, but had risen through the Nubian matrilineal system, took the throne shortly after. The great cathedral of Dongola was officially converted into a mosque. Historians still argue whether this was a moment of violent conquest or a pragmatic local decision by a population that had already begun to drift toward Islam. You walk into the building and see the evidence of the shift. The stunning frescoes of the Virgin Mary and the dark-skinned saints are being covered with a thick layer of white plaster. It isn't an act of hate, but a systematic erasure of one world to make room for another. But here's a quirky tidbit. Even as the capital fell, the Nubian sense of local pride refused to die. In the rubble of the residential quarters, archaeologists have found that people continued to use their Christian pottery and weave their traditional crosses into their clothing for decades. After the official conversion, they were living in a religious ghost state. You might find it funny that a man would go to the mosque on Friday to please the new Kenz al-Dawla governors, but then sneak home to a hidden corner of his house to whisper a prayer to St. George for his sick cow. It is that human refusal to let go of the old ways that makes the fall of Dongola feel like a tragedy of small, quiet moments rather than just a date on a timeline. You notice the physical decay of the city is accelerating. Without a central kingpriest to organize the labor, the great stone fortifications are being used as quarries for local houses. You see a farmer loading a beautifully carved granite lintel onto his donkey. He doesn't see a historical artifact. He sees a sturdy base for his grain mill. The sophisticated plumbing and drainage systems you admired are clogged with sand. The capital has ceased to be a symbol of a unified nation and has become a patchwork of small, local interests. The fall of Dongola didn't mean the end of all Nubians, but it meant the end of the state. The archers of the eyes have scattered. Some have moved south to Alodia, which still holds out in the greenery of the savannah. Others have become local warlords, carving out tiny principalities along the river, charging their own tolls and fighting their own petty wars. You walk through the market and realize that the long-distance trade with the Mediterranean has completely evaporated. The Silk Road no longer detours to the Nile. The isolation that the Nubians fought for 800 years to prevent has finally closed in on them. In the scriptorium of the great church now a silent, dusty room you find a single discarded parchment. It's a half-finished prayer in Old Nubian. The ink faded to a pale brown. The scribe seemingly just stopped mid-sentence and walked away. You realize that literacy is the first thing to go when a state collapses. Without the royal court and the cathedral to fund the scribes, the unique Nubian script is beginning its long slide into oblivion. The stories of the kings will no longer be written. They will be whispered, becoming more like legends with every passing generation. As the sun sets, casting long, mournful shadows across the converted cathedral, you see a small group of people gathered at the riverbank. They are washing their clothes in the Nile, their laughter echoing off the ruins of the palace. They are surviving, as they always have. The kingdom is a memory, but the river remains. You find a seat on a fallen pillar, watching the first stars appear. They are the same stars that guided the pilgrims to Jerusalem and the archers to their targets. You take a deep breath of the cooling air, realizing that you are witnessing the end of an era that lasted longer than most modern empires. The cross has been lowered, the crescent has been raised, and the Nile keeps flowing into the dark. The north has fallen into a state of fractured tribalism and Mamluk influence. But as you continue your journey south, the air begins to change. The dry, dusty scent of the Sahara is replaced by the smell of rain-soaked earth and blooming acacia. You are entering the long twilight of Alodia, while the kingdom of Makuria to the north collapsed under the weight of civil war and intervention. Alodia, the southernmost of the three sisters, has survived in a state of splendid, if increasingly fragile, isolation. You are approaching the city of Sober again, but the golden city you visited centuries ago feels different. The gardens are still lush, and the sakia wheels still groan, but there is a sense of a world holding its breath. You probably wouldn't survive the isolation here. News from the outside world takes months to arrive, and when it does, it usually brings word of another lost cathedral or a fallen city in the north. A mainstream historical fact of this era is that Alodia remained a Christian power well into the late 15th century, outliving its northern neighbor by nearly 150 years, because it was situated further from the Mamluk reach and protected by the vast Sud swamps and the shifting landscape of the Gezira. It became the final sanctuary for the Nubian Christian identity. Historians still argue exactly how the transition to Islam happened here, as there is no record of a great, final battle like the one at Dongola. Instead, it seems Alodia slowly faded out of the historical record. You see a priest in the streets of Soba, his robes mended but clean, leading a procession of the faithful. They are still praying in Greek and Old Nubian, even as the world around them has moved on. But here's a quirky tidbit. During this twilight period, the Alodians became the masters of architectural recycling because they were cut off from the traditional trade routes that brought Mediterranean building materials. They began to use the stones of their ancient Meroitic ancestors to repair their cathedrals. You might see a church wall where a granite block carved with the face of a lion-headed god from 500 BCE is sitting right next to a 14th century brick inscribed with the name of the Virgin Mary. You might find it funny that the Alodians were essentially shopping in their own ruins to keep their present world alive. It's a literal layering of history, a civilization propped up by the bones of its past. You notice that the connection to Ethiopia has grown stronger, with the north blocked by the Mamluks. Alodia has looked east toward the Christian Solomonic dynasty. You see traders from the Ethiopian highlands in the markets of Soba, bringing coffee and mountain honey. There is a sense of a southern alliance of the cross. You realize that Alodia isn't just a dying kingdom, it's a vital link in a chain of African Christianity that stretches to the Red Sea. You see the king of Alodia still called by the old titles, receiving an envoy from the emperor of Ethiopia. They speak of a world where they are the last two lights in the dark. However, the pressure is mounting from within. New nomadic groups, specifically the Funj, a mysterious and powerful cattle herding people from the south, have begun to move into Alodian territory. Unlike the Banu Khans in the north, the Funj are a rising indigenous force. You walk through the outskirts of Soba and see the Funj camps. They are disciplined, mobile, and they have no interest in the old Alodian bureaucracy. They are the new future. The Alodians are trying to manage them with the same marry and assimilate strategy that worked for a while in the north, but the scale of the migration is too large. In the great cathedral of Soba, the frescoes are starting to flake. There is no one left who knows how to mix the ochre and minerals to repair them. You see a young deacon struggling to read a Greek manuscript. The language of the liturgy is becoming a sacred code that fewer and fewer people understand. The long twilight is a time of simplification. The complex urban life of Soba is giving way to a more rural, decentralized existence. The kingdom is dissolving into its component parts: villages, monasteries, and family clans, each trying to survive on its own. As the sun sets over the confluence of the Blue and White Niles, you see the reflection of the white towers of Soba in the water. It is still a beautiful sight, a testament to 800 years of endurance. But you also hear the lowing of the Funj cattle and the sharpening of spears in the distance. The twilight is beautiful, but it is still the end of the day. You find a spot on the riverbank, watching the fireflies dance over the reeds, realizing that Alodia is the last guardian of a secret that has been kept for nearly a millennium. You take a deep breath of the humid air, knowing that when the sun rises again, the world of the Nubian kings will be a ghost, and a new African power will be standing in its place. The long twilight of the south has finally reached its end, and you are standing at the edge of a new world. The year is 1504 CE, and the air around the confluence of the Niles is thick with the scent of wood smoke and the sound of iron being forged. You are witnessing the definitive transition of power. The kingdom of Alodia, the last bastion of the Christian Nile, has finally collapsed. In its place rises the Funj Sultanate, also known as the Black Sultanate. You probably wouldn't survive the sudden shift in social order. The sophisticated, Greek-reading bureaucracy of Soba has been replaced by the fierce, warrior aristocracy of the Funj. The transition isn't just a change in leadership. It is the moment the cross is formally lowered across the entirety of the Nubian corridor, replaced by the crescent and a new, indigenous African Islamic identity. A mainstream historical fact of this era is the alliance between the Funj and the Arab tribes of the north, specifically the Abdalib. Together, they launched a final campaign that effectively ended Alodian sovereignty. Historians still argue whether Soba was sacked in a grand, cinematic siege or if it had become so hollowed out by internal decay that the Funj simply walked through the gates and took the keys. Regardless, the 16th century marks the official birth of the Sultanate of Sennar. You see the Funj leaders, men of deep obsidian skin who claim a prestigious, though likely legendary, Arab ancestry, establishing a new capital further south. They aren't looking back to Constantinople or Jerusalem. They are looking toward Mecca and the burgeoning trade networks of the Red Sea. But here's a quirky tidbit. Even though the state became Islamic, the Funj sultans kept several shadows of the Christian past. In the early years of the Sultanate, the rulers continued to wear robes and headgear that looked remarkably like the vestments of the old Nubian priest kings. You might find it funny that a sultan would lead Friday prayers while wearing a crown that still had the faint indentations where a cross once sat. It's a classic case of political muscle memory. They knew that to rule the people of the Nile, they had to look like the rulers the people had known for 1,000 years. It's a hybrid identity, a bridge between the medieval Christian past and the modern Islamic future. You notice that as the Funj consolidate power, the cultural landscape is being rewritten. The old Nubian script, which you saw the monks painstakingly preserve, is finally falling silent. Arabic is becoming the language of law, faith, and trade. You walk through the ruins of an Alodian church and see that it hasn't been destroyed. It's being used as a stable or a storehouse. The frescoes you once marveled at are now peeling away, the faces of the saints falling into the dust as the plaster dries and cracks. The memory of the archers of the eyes is becoming a folk tale, told by grandmothers to children who now pray in a different direction. The Funj Sultanate brought a new kind of stability to the region, ending the chaotic patchwork period that followed the fall of Dongola. They reorganized the trade routes, focusing on the export of gold, slaves, and civet musk. You see a new class of merchantulars, the Alama, arriving from Egypt and the Hejaz. They are building schools and mosques, filling the intellectual void left by the disappearing monasteries. You realize that while the faith has changed, the Nile remains the spine of everything. The Sakia wheels are still turning, and the farmers are still battling the desert. The rhythm of life is the same, only the names of the holidays have shifted. In the markets of the new sultanate, you see a blend of the old and the new. You find a merchant selling traditional Nubian pottery alongside Islamic brassware from Damascus. The people are adapting. They have traded the protection of the Christian king priest for the protection of the Funj sultan. There is a sense of a fresh start, a new energy that comes with being part of the expanding Islamic world. But in the quiet moments, near the ruins of the old cathedrals, you still see locals leaving small offerings, a bowl of milk or a handful of dates at the base of a fallen stone cross. It's a just-in-case gesture, a lingering respect for the spirits of the ancestors who held this land for 800 years. As the sun sets over the rising towers of the Funj capital, you see the reflection of a new era in the water. The 800-year resistance is over, but it wasn't a failure. It was a marathon that finally reached its finish line. The Nubian Christians didn't just vanish, they evolved. You find a spot on the riverbank, listening to the call to prayer echoing across the savannah. It is a hauntingly beautiful sound, a new melody for an old river. You take a final look at the horizon, where the silhouettes of the old Alodian towers are being swallowed by the night. Knowing that a new chapter of the Nile's story has begun, you are standing on the banks of the Nile in the modern day. But if you close your eyes, you can still hear the creak of the Sakia and the rhythmic thrum of the archer's bow. The great stone cathedrals have been reclaimed by the dunes or buried beneath the silt of Lake Nasser. But the 800-year legacy of the Nubian Christian kingdoms hasn't vanished. It has merely become the bedrock of a modern identity. You are witnessing the echoes in the sand. While the world often looks at the history of the Nile and sees only the pharaohs or the Islamic expansion, you know there is a massive, resilient chapter in between that refused to be skipped. You probably wouldn't survive the transition from the ancient to the modern. Honestly, the sudden arrival of electricity and asphalt over a land that stayed unchanged for a millennium would be a sensory whiplash. A mainstream historical fact that remains today is the enduring cultural presence of the Nubian people in Sudan and southern Egypt. Even though the kingdoms of Nobatia, Makuria, and Alodia are gone, the Nubian languages are still spoken, and the unique matrilineal social structures and agricultural techniques survived well into the 20th century. Historians still argue how much of the medieval Nubian character shaped the modern Sudanese state. Some see the 800-year resistance as the primary reason why Sudan developed such a distinct, localized version of Islam, one that retained the hospitality, the artistry, and the deep-seated communal ties of the old Christian era. You see a modern Nubian house in a village near Dongola. It is painted with vibrant colors, and geometric patterns that look almost exactly like the frescoes you saw in the Cathedral of Faras. But here's a quirky tidbit to carry with you. Despite the official conversion centuries ago, Sirte and Christian rituals survived as folk traditions in Nubia until very recently. In some remote Nile villages, grandmothers would still draw a cross in the sand over a newborn's cradle for protection, or dip a loaf of bread in the river as a blessing that mirrored the ancient Eucharist. They might not have remembered the name of the king priest or the Greek liturgy, but the shape of the faith remained in their hands. You might find it funny that a culture can forget the theology, but remember the gestures. Like a dancer who keeps moving long after the music has stopped, you walk through the ruins of old Dongola. One last time, the desert wind has polished the granite pillars of the throne hall until they shine like glass. You realize that this site is one of the most important archaeological treasures on the planet, a silent witness to a time when Africa held the line against the most powerful empires on Earth. You see a group of archaeologists carefully brushing away the sand from a newly discovered floor. Mosaic. Every shard of pottery and every scrap of parchment is a piece of a puzzle that we are only just beginning to solve. The Nubian kingdoms weren't just a buffer zone. They were a vibrant, literate, and artistic civilization that proved faith and culture could thrive in the harshest environment imaginable. The archers of the eyes are gone, but their precision lives on in the craftsmanship of the local potters and weavers. The monkings are gone, but their sense of spiritual leadership still defines the elders of the river communities. You realize that history isn't just a series of dates and battles, it's a living current. The Nile flows through the ruins of the past and the cities of the present, carrying the same silt that fed the gardens of Soba and the fields of the Fanj. You feel a profound sense of continuity. The Nubian kingdoms didn't fail. They simply finished their part of the story and handed the pen to the next generation. As you stand by the water's edge, watching a modern felucca sail past with its white sail catching the evening breeze, you think about the sheer audacity of those 800 years, 8 centuries of holding a border, 8 centuries of praying in a language that connected the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean, 8 centuries of making the desert drink. You take a final, deep breath of the air. It still tastes of silt and ancient stone. The journey is over, but the story of the Christian Nile is etched into every grain of sand you've walked upon. The sun has finally disappeared behind the black silhouettes of the distant cataracts, leaving a sky filled with more stars than you ever thought possible. The heat of the day has surrendered to a cool, velvety night, and the only sound left is the gentle, persistent lapping of the Nile against the shore. It is a time for rest, for letting the weight of the centuries slide off your shoulders and into the deep, dark water. You can see the faint glow of a campfire in the distance, a small, warm light against the vast indifference of the Sahara, reminding you that humanity always finds a way to endure, to build, and to remember. Feel the stillness of the desert settling around you, a quiet so profound that you can almost hear the heartbeat of the earth. The long walk through the halls of Dongola, the vibrant streets of Soba, and the windswept ramparts of Faras is behind you now. Those kings and queens, those archers and monks, they are all at peace, cradled by the same river that brought them life. Let your own mind drift like a leaf on the current, moving slowly away from the noise of the world and toward the soft, hallowed silence of sleep. The history is safe. The stones will guard the secrets, and the river will keep the memory. Everything is as it should be. The journey is complete, the fire is low, and the desert is waiting to dream with you. Close your eyes, listen to the whisper of the water, and let the peace of the ancient Nile carry you home.